Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It was supposed to be one of those warm, cozy evenings filled with cinnamon-scented air, twinkling lights, and fake smiles stretched over years of bitterness. My mother's house looked like a damn Hallmark card, perfect wreaths on every door, a table groaning under glazed hams and sugared pecans, garlands wrapped around the staircase like it was some kind of magazine shoot. But underneath all that glitter and shine, the air was sharp with tension, like the crackle right before a storm rolls in. We all played our parts. We smiled, we complimented the decorations, we hugged people we couldn't stand, and pretended everything was merry and bright. I held Noah's hand tighter as we stepped inside. He was wearing the sweater he picked out himself, a deep green one with a stitched little reindeer on it, the kind of thing that made him feel grown up, even though he was only 9. His hair was combed, his shoes shined, his eyes full of that kind of hope only a kid can carry into a room like this. And deep down, I wanted to believe, just for a moment, that maybe this year would be different. Maybe they'd see him. Really see him. But of course, they didn't. The gifts were stacked high under the 12-foot tree, all gold ribbons and expensive paper, each one tagged in perfect handwriting. The cousins tore into them first. Lori's boys were first in line, of course. Mason got a drone that probably cost more than my rent back in college. Tyler unwrapped a PlayStation 5 with 3 games already stacked beside it. The whole room clapped like it was a goddamn awards show, all laughter and cheers, Grandma Diane beaming like she was Santa Claus herself. Noah sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, waiting his turn. He'd always been patient, always a little too gentle for this world. When his name was finally called, my heart actually skipped. I held my breath. He walked over to the tree, picked up the small silver box with his name on it, and sat back down on the rug to open it. I watched his little fingers undo the ribbon carefully, so careful not to tear the wrapping. And when he lifted the lid and saw nothing inside, not a toy, not a card, not even a damn peppermint, I swear I felt something inside me snap. He looked confused at first, his eyes darting from the box to the faces around the room, hoping maybe it was a joke. But then Grandma Diane let out this low, bitter chuckle and leaned back in her chair like she was proud of herself. "That boy doesn't deserve anything, right?" she said loud enough for everyone to hear, her voice syrupy and cruel in the way only aging women can make cruelty sound polite. The room went quiet, but not in a good way. It was the kind of silence that sticks to your skin, makes you want to disappear into the floor. Lori tried to fake a laugh, like maybe it was just a joke. My dad looked down at his lap. No one moved. No one said a goddamn word. Noah's face crumpled slowly, like a flower wilting under frost. He didn't cry right away. He just sat there, holding the empty box like it might still hold something if he looked hard enough. And me? I stayed quiet. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't give my mother the satisfaction of seeing me lose it. I just walked over, knelt beside Noah, took the box from his hands, and held him tight. I whispered something, anything, into his ear, just to fill the dead air around us. Then I stood up, took his hand in mine, and without saying a word to anyone else, walked straight out of that damn house. We didn't say much in the car at first. The engine hummed, the heater blew warm air, but the silence between us was heavy as hell. Noah leaned his head against the window, blinking back the tears he hadn't wanted anyone to see. I reached over, ran my fingers through his hair, and hated myself for not tearing into every single person back in that living room. But I knew better. I knew this wasn't the kind of wound you fix with a shouting match. This wasn't something I could patch up with another toy or a sugar cookie. My husband finally spoke after a while. He was gripping the steering wheel like it had insulted him personally. "You should have let me say something," he muttered, jaw clenched, eyes still fixed on the road. Then he looked at me sideways, a hint of something knowing in his voice. "But I know you better, you're planning something." And he wasn't wrong. The next morning, the world outside was white with frost and unnervingly still, like everything had frozen mid-motion, suspended in the same shocked silence that had followed us out of my mother's house. I sat at the kitchen table, fingers curled around a coffee mug gone cold, staring at nothing, but thinking about everything. That moment, Noah sitting there, eyes full of hope turning to confusion, then quiet heartbreak, kept playing over and over again in my head like some kind of slow-motion car crash you can't look away from, no matter how much it twists your stomach. And the worst part wasn't even the empty box. It was that it wasn't surprising. It was just the latest chapter in a book I should have burned a long damn time ago. You see, this didn't come out of nowhere. My mother didn't just wake up one morning and decide to humiliate my son for fun. This kind of cruelty has roots, deep, tangled roots that have been growing for years beneath the surface of every polite family dinner, every fake holiday smile, every time she called Lori, my smart girl, and barely looked in my direction. I was always the second daughter, the difficult one, the one who didn't marry a doctor or host charity luncheons or keep her voice soft and agreeable. Lori was her golden child from day one, and nothing I ever did could outshine that sparkle. Even when we were kids, it was Lori who got the praise, the new clothes, the attention, while I was left to figure things out on my own. When she got her first car at 17, I got a lecture about responsibility. When she forgot to call home for weeks, it was, "She's just busy." But if I missed a Sunday dinner, I got passive-aggressive voicemails about how I was drifting away from family. I spent years telling myself I was imagining it, that maybe I was just being sensitive, but after a while, you stop doubting the pattern and start seeing the damn blueprint. And now it had trickled down to my son, my quiet, thoughtful, beautiful boy who never raised his voice, never demanded attention, never played the flashy, arrogant role Lori's boys had mastered since they could walk. Noah wasn't the kind of kid who made a scene. He loved books more than screens, asked questions that made adults stop in their tracks, and cared too deeply for a world that hadn't earned it. But to my mother, that made him soft. To her, he wasn't worth the wrapping paper. Watching him be dismissed like that wasn't just painful, it was humiliating. It was like watching your child get pushed off the stage you never got a chance to stand on. And what made it worse was knowing exactly how the conversation would go if I confronted her. She'd twist it around like she always did, make it about me being too emotional, too dramatic, too quick to assume the worst. "You're reading too much into it, Emily. It was just a joke. Don't be so sensitive." The same tired lines I've been fed my whole life, like spoiled leftovers, reheated every time I dared to speak up. And maybe that's what burned the most. Not just the cruelty, but the way it would be denied, swept under the rug, made invisible until I questioned whether it had even happened at all. But it did. I saw it. Noah felt it. And this time, I wasn't going to let it slide back into silence. Tell me something honestly, have you ever sat at a table full of people who smiled at you but deep down didn't want you there? Or worse, your child? Have you felt that slow sting when the people who are supposed to love you look right through you like you're just background noise in their perfect little picture? What did you do? Did you stay quiet and swallow it down? Or did you stand up and flip the table? I want to know. Drop it in the comments, because maybe it's time we stop pretending it's all fine when it's clearly not. I sat there for what felt like hours, caught between rage and exhaustion, not sure whether I wanted to cry or break something. My husband came in quietly, kissed my temple, and said nothing. He knew better. He'd seen this pattern too many times before, and he knew I wasn't done with it yet. I kept thinking about what he'd said in the car, about me planning something, and maybe he was right. I didn't know what that something was yet, but I could feel it stirring deep in my gut like a storm just waiting for the right wind. And then my phone buzzed on the table. I looked down and saw my father's name flashing on the screen, followed by a short text message that made my stomach turn. "Your mom wants to talk. Don't overreact. You're blowing this out of proportion." I stared at the words for a long time, the rage simmering just beneath the surface again. Out of proportion. Like my son's tears didn't count. Like an empty box was just a misunderstanding. Like my silence should have been gratitude. I didn't reply. I just set the phone down slowly, took a deep breath, and started thinking about how I was going to burn down a legacy without ever lighting a match. 3 days after the Christmas party, I stood in front of my parents' house again, staring at the same red wreath on the door, the one my mother bragged about every year like it was handwoven by angels. The house looked exactly the same as it did on Christmas Eve, perfect, polished, unbothered, like nothing ever happened, like a child's heartbreak could be wiped clean with a little glitter and garland. I could already feel the script forming in their heads, the same old dance we've done for years, the one where I show up with fire in my chest and they hand me a cup of tea like it's holy water meant to wash away my anger. I didn't want to be there, not really. But I needed to see it for myself, to look them in the eye, to hear what they'd say now that the decorations were coming down and their guilt was catching up with them. Or maybe not guilt, maybe just damage control, the way people do when they realize they might have pushed one step too far. My mother opened the door wearing her softest voice and her most practiced expression, that kind of smooth, polished look women use when they want to convince you you're being unreasonable. "Emily," she said like nothing had happened, like we were just picking up where we left off last Sunday. She stepped aside to let me in, and I walked through that house like I was walking into enemy territory, eyes scanning every corner, every fake smile. Lori was already there, sitting comfortably on the couch with a glass of wine in her hand and her perfect little smirk painted across her face. Her boys were running around the living room, shouting at each other over some game on their new devices, the ones they'd unwrapped so triumphantly just days earlier. The noise filled the air, but none of it reached me. All I could hear was that moment, that 1 second when Noah had opened his empty box and looked around for something, anything, that would make it make sense. My father stood awkwardly near the hallway, not saying much, not making eye contact. He's never been the one to handle conflict. He just nods along, keeps his head down, and lets my mother run the show. And today, the show was clearly about pretending none of it mattered as much as I said it did. So, my mother began, hands clasped in that saintly way of hers, "We just wanted to clear the air." That was her opening line. Not, "We're sorry," not, "We were wrong," just that vague, deflective phrase people use when they want to talk at you without admitting anything. She started explaining how Christmas is always hectic, how sometimes things slip through the cracks, and how maybe we didn't realize how it would come across. I listened in silence, watching the way she chose every word so carefully, like she was walking a tightrope between an apology and a defense. Then she finally dropped the line I'd been waiting for, "You know how I joke, Emily." I didn't mean it like that. There it was. The apology that wasn't really an apology, served up with a passive shrug and a tone that made it sound like I was the one being uptight. Lori giggled softly and added, "Honestly, you've always taken things a little too personally." Her voice was dipped in honey, but her eyes were cold, smug, gleaming with the same superiority that's been there since high school. I wanted to slap that look right off her face, but I didn't. I didn't even flinch. I just stared at her until she looked away, which didn't happen often. Then came the grand gesture. My mother reached behind the side table and pulled out a glossy black box. "We got this for Noah," she said, holding it like a trophy. A brand new tablet. The latest one. "We thought maybe this could make it up to him." She smiled, waiting for approval, like a performer waiting for applause. I looked at the box, then looked back at her. My voice was steady, even quiet enough to cut through the noise in the room. "You don't buy back dignity with electronics," I said flatly. The words hung in the air like smoke. I didn't raise my voice, didn't lash out. I just handed it back to her and turned to leave. Behind me, I heard Lori scoff and whisper something under her breath, but I didn't care. I walked out of that house with my spine straight and my jaw clenched, and I didn't look back. Outside, the wind was biting, and my hands were shaking, but not from cold. It was rage, restrained and burning beneath my skin like a fuse waiting for fire. As I got into my car and shut the door, I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, staring through the windshield at the quiet street, the snow piled on the sidewalks, the calm that didn't match the storm inside me. I exhaled slowly and spoke out loud, to no one but myself. "They think this is over," I said, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "It's not." There's a certain kind of anger that doesn't scream or shake walls, that doesn't flip tables or punch holes in drywall. It just simmers, low and steady, like a flame beneath a steel kettle that never quite boils over. That's the kind of anger I carried with me in the days that followed that pathetic excuse of an apology from my family. Not a wildfire, not a hurricane, just something slow and sharp, calculating and cold in all the right places. Because some betrayals don't deserve rage, they deserve precision. I didn't want revenge that made me look bitter or unstable or angry in the way women are so often dismissed for being. I wanted something different. Something clean, quiet, and unforgettable. Something they would never see coming, not even when it was already burning beneath their feet. It started with a simple idea, the kind that blooms in the middle of a sleepless night, when the house is dark and the only sound is the hum of the fridge and the ache of your thoughts. Noah's birthday was coming up in a few weeks, not a milestone year, just a quiet one, an early spring birthday that always got overlooked in the shadow of Easter brunch and Laurie's boys' more important birthdays. The ones with clowns and balloon arches and catered food trucks. But this year, I wanted to do something different. Not for show, not for spectacle, but for Noah. And maybe, if I was being honest, a little for me too. I started planning an early surprise party, just a few weeks before his actual birthday, something elegant but warm, thoughtful but layered. I rented a venue, nothing extravagant, but beautiful in a quiet way. A historic house on the edge of town, with a sunroom filled with natural light and a long dining table carved from old oak. I picked a local chef to design the menu, simple dishes, Noah's favorites, elevated just enough to feel special. No inflatable castles, no loud music, no cheap decorations, just grace, warmth, and intention. I sent out the invitations a week later, yes, even to the toxic ones. My mother, my father, Laurie, her smug children, and even Grandma Diane, who probably still thought I was exaggerating everything. The invite was polite, almost painfully polite. "We'd love for you to join us in celebrating Noah." That's all it said. No hints, no clues, just enough to make them feel included without knowing they were walking straight into a carefully staged performance where they weren't the stars for once. But there was a second layer to all of this, one no one would see coming. A few days after the invitations went out, I made a quiet visit to a lawyer's office downtown. The kind of place with old wood paneling and a receptionist who doesn't smile unless she means it. I didn't tell anyone, not even my husband, what the meeting was about at first. But when I came home that evening, I went straight to the old desk in the corner of our bedroom and pulled out a sealed envelope I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a letter, thick with legal weight, signed and notarized, one that held a truth no one in my family knew yet. Not even Noah. I placed it on the desk, beside a list of names and a note scribbled with times and dates. The plan was starting to breathe now, starting to take shape like a sculpture under my hands. This wasn't about revenge in the way people imagine it. This wasn't about yelling or slamming doors or cutting ties with some grand announcement. This was about control. About reclaiming something that had been stolen from me long before Noah was ever born. Later that night, as I sat at the kitchen table reviewing the guest list again, my husband walked in, drying his hands on a dish towel, and gave me that sideways look he always gives when he knows I'm up to something more than I'm saying. He didn't speak right away, just leaned against the counter and watched me with those narrowed eyes that had learned to read me years ago. Finally, he asked, "You sure you want to go this far?" His voice wasn't judgmental, it was curious, maybe a little wary, but mostly just respectful. He knew better than to question my instincts. I looked up at him, smiled faintly, and said, "They won't see it coming." And I meant it. The morning of the party arrived with a stillness that felt almost theatrical, like the world had taken one long, steady breath just before the curtain lifted on something no one saw coming. The sky was overcast but soft, pale light streaming through the windows in that quiet way winter sometimes offers a strange kind of grace. I woke early, not from nerves, but from a strange calmness that had settled over me in the past few days, the kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from knowing the pieces have finally landed exactly where they should. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple dark dress with clean lines, nothing too flashy, nothing loud, because I didn't need to scream to be heard anymore. I glanced at the envelope one last time, resting on my nightstand where it had been for days, untouched but heavy with meaning. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't a weapon. It was a truth finally ready to stand in the open air. The venue was already humming with quiet activity by the time we arrived. The caterers were setting the final touches, the long dining table was adorned with candles and soft linens, and the soft strains of instrumental music drifted through the open space. Nothing extravagant, nothing overdone, just thoughtful, elegant, intentional. It was exactly how I wanted it, the opposite of everything Lori ever did, where every event was a competition, a show, a stage for her to perform how perfect her life was supposed to look. Guests started arriving just after noon, one by one, in their usual polished coats and polite smiles, clearly surprised by the upscale setting they hadn't anticipated. I watched them as they stepped inside, my mother, already surveying the room like she was mentally adjusting the decorations, my father, awkward as ever, hands in his coat pockets, Lori, who paused in the doorway just long enough for her smirk to falter, clearly realizing this was not the backyard barbecue she expected. Even Grandma Diane walked in with that familiar air of entitlement, as if she were arriving to be celebrated, not silently dissected. But none of it mattered. Not really, because the only person I cared about seeing was already standing in the center of it all, Noah. My son, my quiet, thoughtful, beautiful boy, standing tall in his navy blazer and soft collared shirt, his hair combed just right, his eyes wide with the kind of wonder that children should never have to lose. And for once, maybe for the first time, he wasn't shrinking in a corner or hiding behind a book. He was glowing. He was seen. And this time, he knew it. The party moved along in the usual way, greetings, laughter, hors d'oeuvres passed along silver trays, polite chatter between people who would have been just as happy avoiding each other. But I waited. I waited until just the right moment, until the plates had been cleared, and the wine had been poured, and the false sense of comfort had settled into the bones of the room. Then I stood up from my seat at the head of the table, tapped my glass gently with a spoon, and felt every eye turn toward me. I smiled softly, deliberately, and raised my glass just slightly. "Thank you all for being here today," I said, my voice even, steady, warm enough to sound gracious, but sharp enough to make them pay attention. It means a lot to celebrate Noah surrounded by family. Because, as we've all been told 1,000 times, family means everything. There was a ripple of awkward nods and murmured agreements, the kind of empty reactions people give when they don't yet know where something is headed. And since family means everything, I continued, reaching into my handbag and pulling out the sealed envelope. I want to share something important. Something long overdue. I placed the envelope on the table in front of me and opened it slowly, sliding out the papers with calm precision. I didn't rush. I didn't fumble. I wanted every second of silence to stretch long enough to make them uncomfortable. "This," I said, holding up the first page, "is a letter from my father's estate attorney. Years ago, after several long discussions, my father appointed me the sole executor of his inheritance. And today, I'm using that authority to make something right." I turned toward Noah, who looked confused at first, then curious, then quietly stunned. "As of today," I continued, "the majority of that inheritance will be transferred into a trust under Noah's name, fully protected, fully his, and fully separate from anyone who ever thought he didn't deserve anything." The table went dead silent. Forks stopped midair. Eyes froze wide open. You could practically feel the heat rise from my mother's neck to her cheeks. Lori's face tightened in a way that told me she already knew she'd lost before she could even open her mouth. And Grandma Diane, God help her, sat there clutching her wine glass like it might shatter in her hand. My mother was the first to try and object, her voice strained and brittle. "Emily, this is absurd. Your father never mentioned any of this." But I didn't flinch. I looked her right in the eye and said, "It's all documented. It's legal. It's done." Then I turned back to the group, let the silence stretch one more second, and delivered the final blow. "You didn't think he deserved a gift?" I said, my voice low and sharp. "Now he owns yours. And just like that, the room split in half between the ones who had seen it coming and the ones who never had a clue. Grandma Diane stood up, her hands shaking, her mouth already forming some insult laced with bitterness, but I didn't give her the chance. "You conniving little," she started, voice cracking. I cut her off with one final line, my smile calm as ever. "Happy holidays." The days after the party passed like slow-moving shadows across a wall, each one bringing a fresh wave of silence from the people who once couldn't stop talking. No dramatic confrontations, no explosive phone calls, just an eerie stillness that felt more damning than any screaming match ever could. The air was thick with the weight of what had been done, and I knew without a doubt that my family had finally begun to realize that I hadn't just thrown a party, I'd shifted the damn ground beneath their feet. I heard through a mutual friend that Lori had stormed out the moment the last guest left, dragging her boys behind her and barking orders into her phone, trying to reach someone, anyone, who could untangle what had just happened. I could imagine her frantically calling lawyers, digging through old family documents, pacing her kitchen in those overpriced heels she wore to feel powerful, demanding answers from people who didn't have any. And I could picture the moment she finally heard the truth. There was nothing she could do. The trust had already been signed, notarized, filed, and sealed. The money was gone from her reach, locked away for a boy she had never seen as anything more than background noise. It didn't take long before I got wind that she had gone straight to my father, pleading with him to intervene, to undo what had been done, to find some loophole or clause that would put the power back in her hands. But there was nothing he could do either. His signature had been on those documents years ago, and his silence at the party had only proven to me what I'd always suspected. He knew this day would come, and deep down, maybe even he knew it was the right thing. Or maybe he was just too tired to fight me anymore. Still, I didn't celebrate with champagne or victory speeches. I didn't gloat or dance in the wreckage. Instead, I sat at the edge of my bed that night, hands folded in my lap, staring at the same envelope I'd finally opened, feeling not victorious, but hollow. The satisfaction was real, but it wasn't loud. It was quiet, delicate, bittersweet like the last sip of coffee gone lukewarm. Because the truth was, this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about healing something that had been broken for far too long, not just for Noah, but for me too. Noah found me there, hours later, when the house had gone still and the soft tick of the hallway clock was the only sound filling the silence. He walked in, barefoot, wearing one of his oversized sleep shirts, and sat beside me without saying a word. After a few moments, he leaned into me, resting his head gently against my arm, and whispered something that caught in my throat before I could even process it. "I don't need their gifts, Mom," he said softly, voice low and clear. "I just needed you to stand by me." That one sentence cracked something open in my chest, something I didn't even know was still locked away. I didn't cry out of anger or regret. I cried because, for the first time in years, I felt like maybe I'd done something right. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but right in a way that mattered more than winning ever could. I held him close, my fingers brushing through his hair, and realized that all the chaos, all the whispers, all the years of being dismissed and disregarded had finally bent toward something beautiful. Not a flashy triumph, not a perfect ending, just a quiet moment where my son felt seen, respected, and loved without having to prove he was worthy. But there was still one piece left, one thread I hadn't pulled yet, a final truth I hadn't yet shared. The recording. The one I'd made on Christmas Eve, when Grandma Diane let her poison spill out in that living room like it was just another glass of wine. I hadn't meant to record it at first. I'd just hit the voice memo button in my pocket, more out of habit than intention. But when I listened to it afterward, hearing her voice so clearly say, "That boy doesn't deserve anything," I knew exactly what I needed to do with it. I posted it anonymously, late one night, in a private Facebook group for local families, one filled with neighbors, school moms, church ladies, and all the same people who had once looked at Grandma Diane like she was some sort of community matriarch. I gave no context, no explanation, just the audio, raw and unedited. The reactions were immediate and brutal. Comments poured in faster than I could read them. People were horrified, disgusted, furious. Who would say that about a child? That poor boy. I hope whoever said this feels ashamed. The reputation Grandma Diane had spent decades carefully polishing began to crack and crumble under the weight of her own words, and for once, it wasn't me saying she was toxic, it was the world around her. I never confirmed it was her. I didn't need to. The people who needed to recognize that voice did. And the people who knew me well enough didn't need the confirmation. They knew exactly who had finally decided to stop playing nice. And in the end, that was the true gift. Not the inheritance, not the party, not the sealed documents or the stunned expressions. It was the moment Noah felt seen, and the moment I stopped begging people to treat us like we mattered. They say revenge is best served cold. But sometimes it's better served quietly, with good lighting, a slow smile, and no warning. I didn't raise my voice. I just raised my son. And now I'll ask you something I still ask myself sometimes when the silence settles in. Was I right to do what I did? Or did I go too far? You tell me, because honestly, I'm still not sure.